This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. This episode of Wet Lunch on the High Seas, I'm very happy to have my friend Joe Flood. Joe Flood is a reporter, the founder and CEO of a Reporters for Hire creative agency, N2 Communications, a former college archery coach, sometimes cowboy, and the author of The Fires, How Bad Algorithms and a War on the Working Class Burned Down and Bankrupted New York, which is being reissued as a video podcast audiobook, which he says is a medium that he claims to have invented. So, Joe, it is a pleasure to have you, a fellow writer, entrepreneur on the podcast. So thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Which BS braggadocio should we get into first? Fake cowboy or inventing a pseudo social media medium? What should we?
Well, let's start with your childhood and educational inspirations, and let's start with I guess the braggadocio started early, or maybe I'm wrong, but let's see how early it began, Joe.
Great. Yeah. I grew up in Massachusetts, of a long-running masshole towny stock. I grew up in the suburbs. My mom was the one member of her family to ever leave Cape Cod. She got about 45 minutes west of the bridge, and now she's back to Cape Cod. She's recently retired in the same house she grew up in. Yeah, my dad's from Newton. He was a cop in Newton, and I grew up in a little bit in Newton, although Newton wasn't really a town you could afford to live in on a local cop's salary particularly well. So I grew up mostly in Wrentham, which is practically Rhode Island, right on the border, about halfway between Boston and Providence.
I don't hear a Rhode Island accent, though.
I can do the Massachusetts is much easier for me. My dad has a really thick accent. My mom, not so much, but her family has one. The Rhode Island one is a little trickier for me. I can kind of do it. I do have a portrait of Peter Griffin somewhere around here that one of my carpenters painted one weekend because he thought it'd be funny to put up on the wall, and I get a kick out of. I always wonder actually, like, whether I had more of an accent before I got to college and it just disappeared there because no one has accents, or if I had, or how that all worked. But yeah, I can slip into it. Friends who visited Massachusetts with me or separately are like, oh, when you do that accent, I thought it was like a jokey, crazy, over the top thing. That's just, I was at Logan and somebody asked me whether I wanted a wine or not.
I've a family who live in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. The gentleman who married my dad's first cousin is from Portsmouth, went to the Abbey, and man, does he have the accent.
Oh, yeah.
In a good way. But have you wanted to be a writer from a young age, or did you sort of stumble into it in college? Like, what was sort of your inspirations, literary and otherwise, and what sort of gave you that motivation to write?
It's a good, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing I sold or got published was when I was 16 or something like that. So at a pretty young age, I was doing it. I was reading all the time, as a kid. I mean, it was basically playing sports, watching sports, and reading books, and a little bit of TV. We would sometimes have cable TV. So when we had cable TV, there'd be a 3 months, for cheap kind of package or something like that. And I'd have MTV for for 3 months or something like that. I'd watch a lot of TV then, but otherwise I was mostly always just reading a lot as a kid. And so, yeah, I think the idea of, doing that became sort of plausible at a certain point because I'd been seeing it done, I suppose. Not physically. I didn't know anybody who wrote for a living growing up or anything like that, but I don't know. It's weird. It's just funny. When you spend a lot of time reading, these characters become characters. I think it's even more prevalent these days with podcasts and things like that, which are, quite literally like a voice inside of your head. when I listen to my stupid like Monday morning NFL wrap up podcast that I've been listening to for 20 years, like it's like, it's as though I know these guys, like I know their ticks. I know their tendencies. I know like, you see what happened at the end of that Broncos game to like cover the spread. Wow. They're going to have some jokes about that. It's like these, and I think it's the same with writing. Like even if it's, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Mark Twain and Nishi, like you feel like you're conversant with them. So I think like, even if you don't, know anyone who does it, these are such important characters in your life that you sort of do. I started young and just
character from a movie about that took place in Cambridge, where Matt Damon's character talks about who he talks to. So I can't help drawing that analogy.
I just made a reference. I'm doing this, as I said, a video podcast audiobook. The medium I'm claiming to have invented because I Googled it with quotes around it and couldn't find it anywhere else.
Well, in today's environment, go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
You weren't reading notes from the underground as a 16-year-old, though. We were just discussing it offline. I have not read it. Did you?
Maybe 17. I definitely read it in high school.
Uh-huh.
I forget which class. That might have been Eileen Schofield's AP English class, senior year of high school. Shouts to Eileen Schofield, the Varian Brothers High School. Yeah, I definitely read it I'm pretty sure we read it in high school, and I certainly read it in I somehow took a rush. We had to take a foreign language requirement, like a class in a foreign literature, like reading another language, which I was incapable of, and somehow convinced the like English department that taking a Dostoevsky class in English should count. I think they were up against the wall because I had not taken any of these classes, and they were like, they needed to either like not graduate me or which because they had screwed up administratively. They were like, yeah, we'll count this. But read a ton of Dostoevsky in that class. Love Notes. Probably my favorite. I mean, Karamazov is beautiful and huge and sweeping and all that. But like Notes is, I mean, just straight internet troll fire 150 years ahead of time, and is kind of beautiful and insane and super thought provoking. And I shouted Matt Damon the other day in Good Will Hunting, because I'm recording this video podcast audiobook of my book, The Fires, from 15 years ago, which they never did an audiobook. And Penguin Riverhead was kind enough to give me the audio rights back. So I've been doing that. And I was just talking about this guy, Walter Danzig, who is the guy who solved the equations on the wall. And it's where the story comes from. He was like a math genius who showed up to class late and thought they were homework assignments on the wall, and came back 2 weeks later and handed them in. And there's different stories. One, he did all of them. One, he did one, but he couldn't understand the other. And he was like, yes, sorry, I don't know how well I did in this assignment. And the teacher was like, no, you didn't get these right. These are the great unsolved equations in statistics. And he's like, no, I'm pretty sure I got them. And he had, in fact, gotten them. Invented the simplex method, which is like maybe the most used algorithm in the world. It's a resource management thing. You could use it for like logistics and like, shipping and stuff like that. He was like a supply management guy in World War II, but it's used for computers use it to allocate chip resources. So it's like used every right now it's being used 1 million times to figure out how we, send the data back and forth to each other and stuff like that. But I digress.
No, I'm actually, it's interesting how the same, living in Philadelphia, this is the home of ENIAC, which is one of the first, if not the first, computers developed at the University of Pennsylvania. How the same amazing technology that helped win World War II went so awry in the 1960s with Vietnam, but also touches on your first book that came out when you were very young. And one thing that really impresses about you, Joe, is that you tend to immerse yourself in your subjects, your literary subjects, where you move there and become part of the community. You move there and really get to know the people, talk to them at ground level, get to hear their experiences. And you're a Massachusetts kid, but after college, you were drawn to the Bronx, the South Bronx. Now, what drew you to the Bronx to write your first book, The Fires, about this urban catastrophe that took place from the late 60s to the mid to late 1970s, which was a nadir for New York City. You had the bankruptcy, you had redlining, the city went from being at the top of the world, a manufacturing powerhouse, a major port by the end of World War II. It made and did everything. But within the course of 20 years, the greatest city in the world, fell into the abyss. Can you talk about what drew you to this subject matter at a deep level? Because you really immersed yourself in it.
Yeah, it was in college. So went to Catholic school outside of Boston and was on was on a partial scholarship, which let me go there. My mom could afford the rest of it. And it was not a Jesuit school, but very similar, St. Francis Xavier oriented, Severian Brothers. So very service oriented. I mean, that was kind of very much a good deeds kind of school, an up with poor people kind of place. And I'd been on all these sort of service trips in high school to sort of get the suburban white boys out somewhere and, pad the college resumes and maybe be useful and maybe learn something. But I'd gone to the Catholic Worker, which is a sort of pretty hard leftist, not limousine liberals, like back to the earth. They don't even believe in like Dorothy Day was the founder, like didn't even really believe, like had issues with Social Security because kind of didn't believe in like the state.
Yeah. Wasn't Martin Sheen very involved in that too?
Yeah, it's a very like, yeah, Martin Sheen. Yeah, well, yeah, and he played Peter Morin in a movie about that, and his depiction was, some people had issues with his depiction, but he was a little more bumbling, I think, in the movie than in reality. But Martin Sheen, yeah, but the Peter Morin, the guy he played, and I used to go to the Peter Morin farm on upstate New York. I was actually just up there recently for a funeral. Monica Cornell, R.I.P., huge influence on my life, and her husband Tom, who was a deacon in the Catholic Church, and was sort of like, I don't know, kind of like a intellectual. I met him in high school, and I used to go to the farm upstate, and then I go to in the city, and I'd live there in the summers. And I'd sort of live in, it's like a shelter. I'd live on like it's kind of a homeless shelter. I mean, it was like a long-term shelter. It wasn't like a overnight turnover kind of place, but sleeping on a cot there, and then like in the mornings and evenings cooking soup and serving, and then going and running around New York and doing stuff, and a fair amount of which was like sneaking into bars. I think we're a little wary of this like teenager who's like there helping, but also like going out and like getting drunk and then like staying out all night because I didn't want to show back up drunk back to the. I was just like, come in at 6 a.m, semi-sober.
20 years.
Anyway, long story short, I was writing an article for Double Take magazine, which is this sort of beautifully printed, I think like Duke Documentary Center funded magazine. Robert Coles was the editor of, about the Catholic Worker. He'd written quite a bit about the Worker. And I was looking at the Lower East Side as a very changing neighborhood. This is like the early 2000s, and it's going from being, it's post that, nadir of the worst days when there's like a joke about, it's like Avenue A, all right, Avenue B, be cautious, Avenue C, something, Avenue D, death, or it was like, these were pretty, shaky times.
The Murder City poster, I think, came out in the 70s. And like, this is an area that Jewish immigrants are like, they moved there and they have these horrible traumatic memories of living in these 2-room apartments. And then their great grandchildren or grandchildren moved there. Like, you want to move there?
Yeah, yeah, and pay 4 million X the rent for the execs.
Would you say
an apartment got painted once?
Side note, given what I've written about, would you say this is kind of an analogy to kind of like the socialist groups for Jewish immigrants at the same time? Like this, that's sort of like one of your inspirations, Marshall Berman, kind of came out of that, the Jewish Marxist tradition. Do you think there's sort of analogous immigrant experiences?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I come from a very like Boston Irish stock, so it's and which is a very conservative immigrant group on the whole, not economically and things like that. So it's not a thing I know super well, but certainly the settlement house movement was an enormous thing on the Lower East Side. I mean, like the Christodora building, which is in Alphabet City, Avenue B on Tompkins Square Park. That was where I believe like the Gershwins learned to play piano there. And it's a sort of like storied place which was set up to sort of stabilize and urbanize and, get the poorer classes opportunities, whether that meant like enough food to get by or a few bucks for rent or, what really the ones a lot of them focused on was educating the young. And this was that neighborhood. I mean, it was Don Corleone's neighborhood, and The Godfather. And I was doing this story through the eyes of the Catholic Worker, the Worker had been like, was founded during the Depression, during like there was a big longshoreman seaman strike in New York, and they were printing a newspaper, a leftist paper, and I think someone said basically to Dorothy Day of like, well, you talk a talk, but are you going to walk a walk? People are hungry. And so she started serving soup And it became like a very, they still have a paper, but it's a very service oriented place. And so I was look at this neighborhood from the 1930s, where it is a poor but upwardly mobile neighborhood. It's an underpaid, overworked neighborhood. And then it changes and it becomes and very upwardly mobile, it becomes an unemployed neighborhood, an addicted neighborhood, drugs and alcohol and things like that. Not upwardly mobile, a much more social service dependent neighborhood with a lot of dysfunction. And the Catholic worker had been through all of this. It had been through those early immigrant days. It had been through the dark times, and by the 2000s, it was gentrifying the neighborhood in a lot of ways. And so I was writing about that, the neighborhood, and I was trying to understand, how does a neighborhood go from sort of poor but mobile and sort of functional and hardworking to like unemployed and dysfunctional. And someone talked about, oh, you mean when the neighborhood burned down? I think it was this guy, Jerry the Peddler, who was this like wacky C-squat activist, like, fighting riot cops to keep like the city from taking over community gardens, like these sort of wacky characters that floated around. And I was like, what do you mean burned down? He was like, dude, this is the densest neighborhood on the planet. All these old buildings have been like profitable, certainly profitable enough, like with cramming enough people into them. Any community garden, new building, vacant lot, parking, lot, anything like that is because something burned down and went bankrupt, burned down, went abandoned in like the 60s, 70s. I was like, oh, that's weird. And then I went and ran census numbers, went to the library on 2nd Ave, and then found out I had to go to Midtown and, there's a Schomburg Research Library, I think, and pull up these census tract information. And census tracts, there's like hundreds of them in each borough in New York. They're 5 square blocks, 10 square, like small areas. And sure enough, these like huge chunks of Alphabet City, where the avenues go from numbers to letters, way over east, you're like a 60% population decrease in these places. And similar with housing units, like the units just disappear. They're no longer there. And I was like, this is weird. This is like, what, it was like a mystery. And then, you come to find out the Bronx and Howard Cosell never said it. The Bronx is burning. But it was happening, and where it was even much worse than the Lower East Side, East Village, and just got super fascinated. In college, I came across a book by Deborah and Roderick Wallace, who are sort of epidemiologists, which is about these studies by the Rand Corporation that were used to close these firehouses starting in the 1960s. And didn't really know much statistics at that point, but like really kind of damning, indictment of a lot of what they were doing statistically, just as bad stats. Not even a sort of like, this is immoral, but it's just like, this is just wrong. Like, it's just not the way you do statistics. And started digging in and trying to understand all this. And then, spent about like 10 years writing the book, because, there's a few things that happen, that with the city burning down, the city actively closes down fire department. That's fire, engine companies, ladder companies, fire marshals, all kinds of different units. About 50 of them from 1968 to 1975, even before well before the fiscal crisis, actually, they start doing it. And it is pitched as really efficient. You'd never think that closing that busy fire company was actually good. But through whiz-bang statistics and counterintuitive modern management techniques, we found it's a great idea. And it wasn't. They closed incredibly busy fire companies. The serious fire problems were turned into, sort of fire epidemics. The companies that were around, I was just looking at one of them. One company, it lost its share. It was two fire engines in one house, and they closed one of them. And the fire engine that stayed quadrupled the number of fires it fought in 2 years. A 4x. And I mean, these are the busiest companies in New York City, which also means the busiest in the world, kind of by far at this point. Just sort of terrible. I interviewed Michael Lewis once, and the journalist, and Moneyball, of course, is one of the great stories of, counterintuitive number crunching, upending old ways of doing things. And the nerds are the heroes, and the crusty old scouts are the sort of non-heroes who have these old bad ideas. And I interviewed Lewis when The Big Short came out, and he was talking about how they're kind of like flip sides of the same coin books. The Big Short is about what goes wrong when you trust in the numbers. When the numbers tell you something counterintuitive, it can go really, really wrong. And Moneyball is about how it can go well. And those are both realities. Like, I love whiz-bag statistical techniques. I had a baseball coach in middle school or elementary school who used on-base percentage and not batting average. Because he was like, what do I care? You hit a single, you get a walk. What does it matter? And whoever had the highest OBP that's who hit first. That's how we organized the lineup, well ahead of Moneyball. I always loved this stuff, but it can go really, really badly.
Well, especially if you don't understand human nature, or if you're often not on the ground, because often like numbers will tell you one thing. And I think if there's one thing I've learned, a lot of things I've learned in my time as a writer, but often like just because you're a nerd doesn't mean you're a good guy. Nerdiness and intelligence does not mean virtue or thoughtfulness or sort of wisdom. And I think that's sort of the divide here. And I think from what my knowledge of the Bronx is as a native New Yorker, although I've lived most of my life in Philadelphia or adult life, is that from the 1920s to the 1950s, the Bronx, like the South Bronx, Grand Concourse, was an aspirational neighborhood. It was where you moved after you made enough money in the Lower East Side or whatnot to move to upper middle class apartment buildings. East Tremont, which Robert Caro talks about in our favorite New York documentary, says, this was a self-contained neighborhood. Another thing that happened to the Bronx, among many, was that you had a big interstate driven through it, which ripped through East Tremont, which was a middle class neighborhood. This was and as I think you talk about the Lower East Side.
No, Stephen, it was a horrible slum. They commissioned a study and it said it was a terrible slum. And the study was definitely not biased or totally bogus, that it was wretched and that running a highway right through the middle of it would make it awesome.
And it certainly did not. It ripped it to pieces. And one of the characters you talk about is, how can you not talk about this guy if you're not writing about mid-century New York, is Robert Moses. What was his role in this look at the Bronx? I mean, he had such a scorn for so much of like these areas. And he said, well, the numbers say that we need more highways. The numbers say this, now get out of your house. How does he play in here?
Moses is a huge figure. I think one of the things that's important to remember, though, is that he is not the one guy thinking these things are good ideas. I have a line in the book about, that he ruled not by decree, but with cash-greased consensus. The cash helped. Everybody got paid. The building trades, the politicians getting tips on where the highways are going to go, and this
Where
and
Trump
that and
got
the other.
paid.
Yeah, there's just exactly. There's all these people that get paid, but there's a real mentality that these are good ideas. This is all over America. My grandfather grew up in Scully Square, like the West End in Boston, which is now Government Center. Scully Square was a mixed Irish-Black neighborhood. It was the red light district. This is kind of a tough neighborhood and all that, but it was like a functional, upwardly mobile, like sort of a place where people are moving along. It was an integrated neighborhood. Boston was actually a much more integrated place. Of course, we know about the busing, problems and things like that in like the 60s, 70s. Boston was actually a much more integrated city than people realize before this era. They went through and de-integrated all of these neighborhoods by tearing them down and putting up Government Center. I mean, a Boston Globe reporter literally went out, knocked over trash cans in the West End, and then took pictures of it. Like, look at this terrible slum. It's so dirty. And then they went and they bulldozed it and kicked everybody out and built a wretched Government Center with nothing going on, lived in only by homeless people at night.
Promenades go from no place to nowhere, as Jane Jacobs said.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. The empty promenades. I mean, so there's a real sense around the entire country that the government needs to be that there's a good instinct. I mean, a lot of this I think comes from Jacob Riis and sort of like showing the plight of a lot of the, immigrant poor, and not always immigrant poor, just poor in general, and showing, the rest of the fancier parts of America, how the other half lives. There's a quote from like Lionel Trilling that I have in the book about how there's a problem when we first make people the objects of our concern. Then it becomes pity, then it becomes sort of dictates, and then it becomes coercion. And I think you see this cycle play out in America. People, the upper classes think we've got to do something for these poor people. And pretty soon they're kicking people out of their homes and saying, no, it'll be good. The numbers say so. I mean, Jacob Riis, this gets forgotten. Jacob Riis kicked thousands and thousands of people out of their homes. The tenement laws he helped put through were very good. Airflow, water, stuff like this is extremely important. But his earlier forays into public policy involved shutting down thousands and thousands of rental apartments because, under this belief that the slum itself was the problem. There's this, sort of heuristic confusion, which is like kind of a mathy term. Like a heuristic is a stand-in, that you use to like sort of, it's hard to understand the whole of a thing. So you use a statistical stand-in to get, a sense of it. How good's a baseball player? I don't know. Let's use their on-base percentage as a heuristic, for how good they are. And he starts to confuse the people and the situations for the land itself. And there's this thought that the issue is the slum is the building. If we wipe out the slum building, everything will be fixed. We can build housing projects. We can build, markets. The problem is you take thousands of people who are poor and living in really difficult conditions because they are poor, because they cannot yet afford better. And then you're turning them into essentially refugees. You take their homes away and give them nothing. Mm-hmm. And say like, this will definitely help. I'm no Marxist, but Marx is a really interesting writer. He writes about Paris, or no, Engels, excuse me. Engels writes about, the method they call Haussmann. When Paris gets rebuilt under, a dictator, Napoleon III, and Haussmann rebuilds Paris quite beautifully. Whenever there's a top-down rebuilding of a city like that, it's usually ugly. Haussmann, well,
did a good job, except for those zinc roofs, which are now apparently not good for climate change because they get really hot.
Is that right? Well,
but it's interesting, though, how like in the 1930s, however, you have another mindset coming in, and this shapes so much of New York development, cities across the country, is the international style comes in thanks to Le Corbusier, who's a Swiss-French architect, and his ideas are promulgated by people like Philip Johnson and also Robert Moses, where this idea of, we tear down the slums. I mean, Le Corbusier, there's a famous video of him showing like, let's tear down Haussmann's Paris and create these towers, what he called the Radiant City. And the international style, speaking to one architectural historian, he said, the international style was basically a European style import that was taken up by the Northeastern elite at places like Harvard Design School, which imported Walter Gropius, who fled the Nazis. And there was a ceremonial destruction of the neoclassical orders at design schools like Harvard and Penn and MIT, where we're starting anew. And this architectural historian said that the international style, which shaped so much of later post-war housing development, was essentially an upper-class Eastern elite import that was put onto American cities, and very mixed, to say the least, success, focused on the car and on towers and efficiency, machines for living, versus neighborhoods.
Yeah, and it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how humans operate. It has become, increasingly clear what social ties and, intra-community, like sort of networks and jobs and overlaps and things like that really mean to people and places. And they just had it wrong. And to me, I think one of the big things too is it's the coercion piece of it. Like if the cities were deciding, if we're talking about like independent developers are acquiring lots and deciding we want to build promenades to nowhere with no promenades. We want to build these giant skyscrapers and we want to do X, Y, Z. We want to get rid of things. If all the factory owners in New York were suddenly saying like, never mind, I want to tear down my factory. I want to build a high rise for lawyers. If that's happening, that's happening. The market has excesses, but I tend to default to the market, particularly when it's a bottom-up market of like individuals making decisions on their own, independent of one another. What you see in this era is this is not the market doing this. This is the government showing up and acquiring land, which means eminent domain, which means taking it from people, no matter what they say. And Moses was the master of this. You just take their land. A really fundamental invasion of really what I think of as like pretty core American rights, which are around like property rights, contract law, things like that. And they are going in, and then not only are they taking this land away from people and tearing it down, they're buying it at very little if you're a nobody from you, and a lot if you're like the Kennedy family, which got like 10x the normal land prices for their land for what became Lincoln Center. If you're connected and you're a developer and they're taking your land, you're excited because you're going to get a sweetheart deal on it. Then they're going and they're taking this land and they are giving it away to other developers at a fraction of what was paid. They are issuing municipal bond issuances saying like, hey, you don't have to borrow the money. We'll do it. The city and state will do it. This sort of weird interstate agency will do it, which is adding to the public debt, which becomes a huge issue in New York City in the 1970s. And then they're giving away real estate tax abatements. New York City goes essentially bankrupt in 1975, and it usually just gets blamed on liberalism. New York had too many poor people, and New York was too generous to those poor people. There's a little bit to it. There was certainly like welfare fraud and things like that happening. They were real issues. But like what they failed to mention is that New York City went from being, it was 72% of New York City paid full real estate taxes in like 1950, 1955. By the mid 70s, only 60% of New York City was paying full real estate taxes. You're talking about wiping out 10, 15% of your entire tax base or real estate tax base. And in New York City, that's the predominant tax base. Governments are not a business, but people would like them to be. And so let's use business terms. If you're a company and you just decide to wipe out 15% of your revenue, you shouldn't be shocked that you're going bankrupt. New York City's welfare rolls in this period actually rose more slowly than the rest of America, as did benefit increases. New York was not, it was no massive jump in what New York City was spending on poor people. There is a massive jump on what New York City is not collecting in real estate taxes because of things like Stuyvesant Town, which I was just doing. I was recording some book stuff the other day. Stuyvesant Town, the old gas house district. They took 11,000 people's homes, 500 factories and other sort of working facilities, schools, churches, all these things, wiped them out. They bulldozed 40 acres. I mean, 40 acres in New York City is an enormous, enormous amount of land. They kick all those people out, all these working class, mostly Irish, Jewish, Armenian folks out. Then they go to the MetLife. They give them the land for a fraction of what they bought it for. They give MetLife enormous tax abatements. It's not really paying real estate taxes in any sort of normal way. And then MetLife says, great, we're going to build housing, and it's going to only be for middle-class whites.
Do you think there was this actual kind of scorn for industry in the 50s
Yes.
and 60s? Because New York, we forget about that. Today, we think about New York as a financial center, a creative center, but it was a port in the mid-1950s. You had not just ocean liners pulling up along the Hudson, but you also had break bulk freighters pulling up there. You have the whole on the waterfront culture. You have, the proverbial, schmata factories, making clothing in the garment district. They made everything. And you have all these little ecosystems going on. Do you think there was this kind of like on the part of a certain class of people, just kind of like this was there? And I feel like I'm going on a limb here, like an ick factor, or we're sort of beyond
Yes.
that, or
100%. And I don't mean to be like cast too many aspersions or whatever, but I think you can imagine the monocles falling out as people catch a whiff of coffee being ground on the streets, and and then there's a slaughterhouse near where this happens and that happens. All these things are like, oh, I think that's a real thing. I mean, I'll personalize a little bit. It's a little bit like people who have a distaste for hunting but eat meat. It's a little bit like, I think we saw this in the 90s, where it was like, it started then and really continued of like the idea that like by outsourcing all American manufacturing, there's no longer a stinky smoke, stack, somewhere. Well, the smokestack is now just in a different place. And there's even more smoke as the goods are being shipped from China to America as well. It's this distaste with having to deal with the realities of where you get your food, where you get your clothing, where you get all these things. I mean, as you said, New York was I believe one of, if not the biggest producers in the world, certainly in America, of textiles, of food, produced food, of beer, actually. New York was like the biggest beer city in America. All these things happen. And then New York City closes the port in Manhattan, and they do it to build the World Trade Center.
Yeah. Well, there's also containerization. That's a huge.
It's a huge thing, and this was going to happen. So for those who aren't familiar, break bulk shipping, which is like, on the waterfront, like big burly guys getting on there and hauling boxes full of stuff and rolling barrels off onto the docks and all that. And then you go to shipping containers, and shipping containers, we all know what those are. People build clever houses out of them and things like that. You can take a shipping container, you can fill them up, you can stack them super high on these huge container ships, and then you can just have cranes that come by, grab it, swing it, drop it directly onto the back of a Mack truck, and it drives on out. And you don't have to uncrate and do all this processing and all this stuff. It's a much more efficient way to do these sorts of things. Containerization was coming, but it wasn't like like the Port of Manhattan was suddenly not working. And because of the massive competition of these more efficient, container ports that needed more land. There were no container ports. They shut the Port of Manhattan before there was a container port, because the first container port in the world is Elizabeth, New Jersey, where they moved the Port of Manhattan to. This was the first one. This isn't a case of like, Google like laying off some traditional search engineers because AI search has gotten so successful these days. This is Google shutting down its entire search engine to start an AI search engine that doesn't exist yet. This is them out. They're shutting these things down before the competition even exists. And you have enormous, New York City, after they shut the port, about 1,000 industrial firms a year close in New York City. Mm-hmm. New York loses 600,000 industrial jobs in about a 10-year stretch. That is more than Detroit ever had. Mm-hmm. The deindustrialization we've talked about is having had terrible effects on America and the Rust Belt and these places over the last 30 years. Nationwide, America lost 6 million industrial jobs. New York City lost 10% of that in New York City, in this tiny little area. And unemployment goes through the roof. 80% youth unemployment in the Bronx. A 35% cut in average incomes in New York City. A million people on welfare in the 1970s. New York City is actively destroying these jobs. They are closing the port that all these businesses are relying on. They are zoning factories out of existence. They are bulldozing them to build Metro Tech, to build the World Trade Centers, to build all these places. They are then taking these places off the real estate tax rolls, so they no longer pay real estate taxes.
But people are still making money off it. They're just not the city.
People are making money off it, and they're making money off the government because the market is not supporting these things at all. The World Trade Center, and this has nothing to do with the terrorist attacks or like the incredible heroism of the people that responded. The World Trade Center was a terrible business move always. The city lost, by the time the city goes bankrupt, it had lost about $700 million in tax revenues from it. It didn't pay taxes. Mm-hmm. There were 30,000 jobs cleared from it. One of the largest food markets in the world, the Washington Square Market, wiped out. The Radio Row, the electrical retail district, and electrical manufacturing district wiped out. People talk about Soho, Tribeca, which became these sort of empty, neighborhoods, and then the fancily educated artists move in, and it's a great rebirth. And it was before that, it was a mess. Well, the reason it had only been abandoned for a few years. The reason was because Soho and Tribeca were factories, largely for a lot of it for Radio Row. There were all these little electrical assembly plants and things like that. Some of this business actually moves to Hong Kong and Taiwan. Right before the birth of the personal computer, might have been good to have America's primary electrical manufacturing district still operating, but might have been kind of useful to have that. These are really bad decisions, and they're paid for with taxpayer dollars.
And how this affected the Bronx in particular, you had redlining, which was something that was actually started up in the New Deal, where we tend to see the New Deal these days in a positive light. But one thing the New Deal did do was that, we'll take these scientific looks at neighborhood, quote unquote, and if there's Black people moving in this area, you can't get a mortgage, you can't get homeowners insurance. And that really accelerated by the 1950s. And you have this thing going on where you have the first wave of immigrants that came in the 1880s through the 1920s, when the immigration laws basically shut out people from Southern and Eastern Europe. They're starting to move out to, they moved from the Lower East Side and Little Italy to the South Bronx, Grand Concourse. So by the 50s, they're moving out to Long Island or North Jersey. But you have these other waves of coming up. You have Hispanics coming up from Puerto Rico. You have the Great Migration from the American South. Can you talk about how these migrations affected the Bronx and the deindustrialization and ultimately the burning of a lot of the Bronx in the 1970s? What was going on here when you inject immigration and race into this and redlining?
Yeah, I mean, so New York has always been a fraught ethnic mix, right? Like you read the histories and there's always, whenever a new group shows up, everybody's like, these Irish, God, just drunk and violent, and the women are throwing away their babies in the streets. I mean, these are things being written about. And, there's some truth to it because the Irish are a particularly traumatized group of people. I mean, most of Ireland disappears in 20 years in Ireland. It's like, 20, 30% of the people starve to death during the potato famine, and the rest migrate. They're showing up on these coffin ships with horrendous mortality rates. And the Irish are in a tough strait when they come to America. But they, like everybody else that comes to New York, they come to New York to go to work. And they're able to. They dig the Erie Canal and the subway tunnels and things like that. Certainly I think you were one of the best working historians on Jewish immigration to America. And I think that that the same deal there. They're doing things and each group ends up in different sort of trades and things like that.
Start off with a push cart selling whatever on the Lower East Side. And that was trauma, like let alone getting kicked out of the Russian or leaving the Russian Empire and saying goodbye to everyone you knew and having the Cossacks kill your family. Then you show up in the Lower East Side. Next thing you know, you're pushing push cart with cloth or, all sorts of other little goods. There's I remember I read, Lauren Bacall's memoirs, and, she went from being, her family came over from Romania, and what her family talked about with horror was not so much like the pogroms in Romania, but like, well, Grandpa Max had a push cart, and they'd always say push cart in whispers, like, we don't talk about the push cart. It was so.
Yeah, and I think that but that is a touch of that distaste. I mean, these are tough lives and tough jobs. But I think that when you move up the ladder, there's a tendency to either romanticize the simple days of poverty, or to vilify them, and sort of like, dear God, can you imagine we had to do physical labor at one point, and I think there's a real distaste for that really crops up. I think that the sense, in America was that like to continue working with your body was somehow dehumanizing or horrifying, like that. And like if you weren't an educated person working with, pencils and pens and eventually computers, that you were some kind of lesser than person. And I come from a blue collar family. I did good on tests and stuff, and I was like, great, I'm gonna go to college. My dad was a high school dropout and stuff. I was, he was joined the Marines in the 60s, and he, he was like, and then he became a cop. Had someone take a high school equivalency test for him because he can't really read very well, and did this, and struggled. He said, like, you're good at books, go to school, you can make more money than I did, And I was like, all right, cool, that makes sense. But I spent a lot of my life doing labor jobs, and I remember like in college, I used to clean bathrooms in the dorms because it was the best pay on campus by a long shot. And it was funny how horrified people would be when I would show up to clean their bathroom. And they would just like, their jaw would drop. And it was like particular, and it was a very interesting thing, that like to have like an immigrant who didn't speak English come and clean their bathroom would be fine because they don't really treat that person as a person. That's that's not really, they're not one of us.
I think that's what a lot of what was going on in the South Bronx was they don't count, whatever, they don't matter. So
yeah, this is the tides of history are going to wash them away anyway. Like pretty soon there'll be no more manual labor at all. Like this is all going, it's just sort of like, it's all this stuff that's treated as a sort of inevitable sweep of history. We sort of got this in the internet era. Like, well, you couldn't possibly regulate anything on the internet. Like, why not?
Well, I think here's the sort of paradox with sort of, like a lot of the people behind all this is on one hand, if you're trying to build a neighborhood, it's like, oh, we can't possibly let people develop their own things. We have to, or build their own communities because we have to manage the crud out of everything.
Leave it to them.
Then when it comes to the people of the internet, we can't possibly regulate that. But when it comes to other people's stuff, like we have to regulate the living heck out of everything because, we just can't give up control. We can't, God forbid, we let people do their own things in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, the undercurrent is very clear. College degree equals smart, trustworthy, can do your own thing. No college degree, you're a moron. We need to make every decision for you. I'm being a big sort of, I'm hyping it up and I'm using sort of blunt language, but that is the undertone. You read these documents. My friend is deep in a Robert Moses project. Eileen Markey, shouts to Eileen, another fellow writer, historian, is deep in some Moses archives and sending me these pictures of them. And all these letters from Moses, but also from the City Planning Commission and the mayor's office and all the good governance groups and, progressive reform groups. Talk about like, there's a need. The city needs more housing is never the statement. The city needs to build more housing. The city itself needs to do this is always the statement. We can't possibly let, a bunch of grubby contractors. We can't let the immigrant entrepreneurs who dominate the real estate industry in New York. I mean, there are people who have become plutocrats off of New York real estate, but they are mostly people who started out as sort of immigrant entrepreneurs who got the cash together to buy a building and rent it out and then buy another building, and they build these empires. And it's often seen as that's a very déclassé kind of, business, to be in that sort of grubby, they administer you're a
property
landlord, property manager. Oh, you have to paint things and you carry keys on your hips. You know what I mean? This couldn't possibly be. You're not a management consultant or a lawyer. Like this is, this is a grubby little thing. And there's a real disdain for these people that is palpable you can just read it. You can, in the literature, the government has to do this. You can't possibly trust the market. You can't possibly trust individual business owners and factory owners to do these things themselves. There's a line from Nietzsche, right, about like, careful lest you stare into the abyss too long and it stare back at you, And I think that there's an element of that with the Soviet Union. America's fighting so hard against the Soviet Union in this era that it starts to sort of envy and emulate some of its techniques, which is that you have a bunch of engineers somewhere who make all the decisions, and that's just that.
You just deal with it and be like, well, they know what's best. Yeah, and this sort of ties into another passion of yours, the World of the Great Plains and the Lakota people who you spent a lot of time with. You made the jump from city to the Great Plains. We can talk about it a bit later, but my family on my dad's side is from Wyoming, and being Japanese American, they experienced tremendous racism and setbacks there. I mean, a lot of, they did work with their hands. I mean, my father grew up on a farm with an outhouse. They didn't have indoor plumbing until 1957. And his grandfather was a engineer on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. He was a machinist who refined wheels of these giant steam locomotives. And that's something that I grew up with, was kind of like this. Yes, you can read books, but you always have to have respect for people who make things or do things. They might know more than you, in spite of all your schooling. And I think I'm very grateful for my father for that. And I think, and also the trauma of Japanese American internment, which my father did not directly experience because they did not live on the West Coast, but there was always that fear. But
well, you told me the story. There were internment camps near where your family lived, but they were only putting, you said people on the Pacific coast were going into them.
Which was 90% of most of the Japanese American population. It was basically a land grab, actually kind of similar in that the Japanese Americans on the West Coast, in places like California and Washington State, especially in California, they had taken kind of third-rate farmland and turned into very productive truck farming. And of course you have racism, but there's also this feeling of like, how did these people who we just can't stand, how come they gain so much prosperity of this land no one wanted? So come Pearl Harbor, it was like, this is the moment. We can now take it. And
yeah, and the Ken Burns documentary on the war has some called The War, and World War II, some great stuff on this. And there's these portraits of these families that had this land taken. And in some cases, you do have like neighbors who ran it well and actually, and the land went back to people. And a lot of people, it's just a straight up land grab.
Oh, it was you had 36 hours to sell everything you had and show up and report to the racetrack and be taken by a steam-driven train to some godforsaken place near my dad's hometown of Worland, Wyoming, or in the places in Utah that were like the least desirable land in the country when it came to growing anything. But my family was spared that fate because we did not live on the West Coast. There was some talk in the town, apparently, well, how come these people, the Uchifusa families, how come we don't take their farm away? But I think that actually does tie in with what happened in the Bronx, a lot of New York City, and on the West Coast of kind of a land grab. And often when they say it's not about the money, it's totally about the money. And I think there was a huge reluctance on the part of the liberal establishment backing FDR to defy FDR and a lot of the people around him, because he was the hope and savior of so much of the country's working class. I mean, the Roosevelt coalition was born and bred in New York City and kind of ran New York City through the LaGuardia term all the way to the 50s. But during the war, there was this no one wanted to defy FDR. I mean, ultimately, I believe without him, we would not have won the war. I think he was a great wartime president, but this was a tremendous stain. And even his own attorney general, Francis Biddle, when he did finally sign off on it, he said, we're going to regret this. We really are. But I think that what I see going on here in the Bronx, did anyone who you write about, and you write about how the best of intentions or the closing of these fire stations, the destruction of thousands of apartments, did anyone in later life say, oh my God, we made a huge mistake?
Well, it's an interesting. I mean, yes, certainly there are people, but one of the things that's really interesting is how little many people showed, because they didn't understand themselves what they were doing. And I think that's one of the things that when you're dealing with these like deeply complicated statistical sort of approaches to these things, is that like you don't necessarily understand how it trickles down through the system. Because in the old days, you take like real estate, for example, right? There was obviously tons of racism in real estate always. That's just how these things go. But it was inconsistent. Any one landowner could do what they wanted. Any one city official or mortgage banker or whoever could sort of do what they wanted. And any one person could maybe bribe somebody to look the other way. We don't normally give Italians mortgages, but, somebody greased my pocket. And like these things, these things are inconsistent along these lines. And that changes when you have policies that are sort of algorithmically determined. There's no arguing it. There's no getting around it. These things just go down the line. So it's and that, red line is a good example where suddenly you can no longer get a mortgage if you're black. Or in some cases, you could get an incredibly expensive mortgage if you were black, but white people can't get one in the same neighborhood because this has been deemed a black neighborhood by the red line maps. It's like, in many cases, we're talking like, very integrated neighborhoods. It's like 20% Italian, 20% Jewish, 20% black. They say like, nope, it's black neighborhood. That's the end of the story.
This mixed neighborhood does not compute. It just does not compute. It's too complex. It does not compute.
Does not compute because certainly the hoity-toity people who are like running the banks can't imagine living in a mixed neighborhood. That doesn't. Then there's this amazing bit in Jane Jacobs where she's talking about the North End in Boston, where she's visiting Boston. She's certainly spent time there, and she's in the North End, and she loves it. It's very much a Jane Jacobs neighborhood, right? It's dense and these old weaving alleys. And there's so much life and restaurants and coffee shops. Everything's out in the street. And she goes and gets in touch with an urban planner friend of hers in Boston, and she's like, "Oh, I'm in the North End." And he goes like, "Oh, love it. Every time I go to the North End. It's just a terrible slum though. We're going to have to tear it down." It's just like, what? And he's like, "Oh yeah." And he cites a bunch of statistics, the density, the age of the buildings, it has to be torn down. It's a slum. She's like, "Really? What about like, are the disease rates high? Are the unemployment rates high? Are all that?" She says, "Oh no, actually it's shockingly low levels of tuberculosis and all these different things." She's like, "Well, then what's the problem?" If you love being in the neighborhood and these social problems don't exist there, why would you have to tear it down? And he's like, "Oh, well, the stats say so." And they were doing this. Fortunately, the North End was saved, but the West End was not. And this happens all over New York. And it's this funny abstraction. But we see this with all kinds of policies. And, this is what happens with you talk about, did people regret this? I mean, I talked to an aide for Mayor Lindsay, who was overseeing he was the mayor of the city at the time of these cuts in the fire department. And he talked about what a great job the NYC Rand Corporation did with all these studies, revolutionary studies on how to manage cities, which included closing all these fire departments as neighborhoods were starting to burn and then went into full conflagration mode. And then he also talked about all the great work he did in some of these neighborhoods that were burned out in the 80s to rebuild housing. And I said, you close fire companies in that. I cited him the fire companies. I was like, the Rand studies closed these things and then the fires got way worse and then you rebuilt it. Did you ever think that maybe if you just left the neighborhood alone and not close the fire company, you wouldn't have had to rebuild it later? And his mouth kind of went agape. He was like, I never really thought about it like that, but I don't, it was like, how could you not think about it like that? But, lost in his little world, the connection wasn't made. And I think the important thing, and I think this is a thing we have with a lot of activists, it skews, I think, a little more liberal, but it goes both ways. It's another kind of heuristic confusion. Are you looking to help people? Or are you looking to look like you are helping people? Are you trying to assuage your own need to feel altruistic? And I think that when you are isolated from the communities you're trying to help, when you only know them from with the plane's eye view of an overhead housing map, when you only know them as algorithmic entities, statistical problems to solve, you are very likely to screw that stuff up. And that's, I think, what happens a lot of times is that you will tear down the North End, even though the time you went there once, it was delightful, because a bunch of stats tell you it has to be bad. No one living there says so, but your stats do. And that isolation, I think, is where you get it. Michael Lewis had a great line when I interviewed him that time. I'm writing 50-page trying to get at this ideas. And he says, the problem with statistics is not when a anecdotal field, an arts and letters instinct experience kind of field is exposed to analytics for the first time, to hard numbers for the first time. There's enormous gains. There's so much low-hanging fruit to be had. And really smart people come to the fore because they're using the math as another hard way to think about complicated problems. The issue is when you use the numbers as an excuse to not think about how complicated the problems are. When you use the numbers as the numbers say so we're just doing it. That's that shift in that moment is where you have the big problem. And I think that's where, and it's a thing that we see all over society right now. And I think we always will, as long as there's, algorithms and technology and then actual reality, there's going to be a gap. And people who only know one side or the other are going to make mistakes.
I also think that there is among a lot of, people we went to school with, is that there's a tremendous fear of managing the boring. And a lot of life is just boring. A lot of life is just trying to, when you start off as a writer, writers like you and I do, are like, oh, we're going to change the world and we're going to live, and then you realize a lot of what you do, the writing business or getting clients or just sort of, it's kind of like running a carpentry shop in many ways. And you're just kind of trying to keep things going. And I think statistics and high level analysis on one hand can make you seem very glamorous, but also I think that there's this lack of how do I just deal with the boring nitty gritty stuff? And a lot of what happens in, say, manufacturing is from an academic standpoint, kind of mundane. But if you don't master the mundane, the business fails. I've done work for a family-owned firm in Philadelphia. It's been around since 1864. It's been in the same family. They manufacture bolts, construction bolts, carriage bolts. And I look at this family, and they start off as Irish immigrants. And by the second, third generation, they're going to the Wharton School. And if you look at what the Wharton School originally was set up for in 1880, it was set up by a steel tycoon, a gentleman named Joseph Wharton, who was known as the Quaker Duke. He controlled Bethlehem Steel. And you look at who went
employed Taylor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean,
the original management consultant.
Yeah, and Bethlehem Steel was a massive corporation at the time. But yeah, but you look at who attended the Wharton School through the 50s. It was often people who, the sons of guys who owned small to medium-sized factories. And they were trained to learn the nuts and bolts of business and accounting so they can go run the small family factories in like Northeast Philadelphia or New York, or these manufacturing firms you talk about in New York City. I mean, we're not talking pipeline to Goldman Sachs. We're talking nuts and bolts, literally stuff.
Yeah, literally.
But yeah, I mean, also what came out of Philadelphia is scientific management. Frederick Winslow Taylor, who, yeah, I mean, he was the guy who, I mean, he actually lived not too far from where I'm living. And he was someone who reduced workers to cogs in a machine, to statistics. And he was also came out of that other tradition of scientific management, of not wanting to be at the ground level. He didn't see, what actually he didn't want to see, I don't think. But I think he would have, done very well at the Rand Corporation.
Yeah, well, I think there's also an element. This is why Plato would have banned the poets, I think. In the Republic, right? Plato talks about it, no poets allowed. Like they're out of here. They're a destabilizing force. I think this is, I think like this is maybe one of the reasons why, is that when people confuse artistic ambitions with any other walk of life, I think in some ways the creative is some of the highest ambitions in many ways for a lot of people who've, sort of from comfortable backgrounds and things like that. And I think that like this is one of the problems with the urban planners. It's one of the only art forms that is forced upon a society. And I think that that's one of the big differences, that you are trying to grapple with these big, fancy, abstract ideas and ideals and reshape things. And let's revolutionize this stuff. That's like super cool when you're doing it on canvas or on paper or with, music, audio, like whatever it is, because no one's really losing. Maybe the old style of jazz loses because the new one gets pop, but like, we're not talking about like destroying people's homes, and creatives are megalomaniacs. They have to be, right? Like, it's writers, certainly, because we control everything, right? And it's no different in film. It's no different in all these places. Architecture and urban planning, and then this kind of industrial planning, is one of the very few places where an artist can force their vision on other people. And, it's one thing to make a crazy movie. People can see it or not. That's up to them. You don't have a choice when someone comes in, bulldozes your neighborhood, and puts up a brutalist building. That is, and maybe it's a very pretty building. Who knows? But like,
don't knock brutalism now. I'm kidding.
It's gotten very hot. Yeah,
I can't stand it.
Back,
anyway,
baby.
Now it's become very chic. The 70s is chic again. It's now become a period.
Everything that's old looks good. I mean, that's kind of the reality, right? Like, that's the thing. Have you ever looked at any really, really old building and thought like, that's hideous? Like, that's so like, I mean, I'm sure like, 200 years from now, maybe brutalism will be pretty to everybody. I think it's, like anything that stands the test of time has something to it and looks kind of cool and interesting.
So one day the old Whitney Museum will actually be people will be beloved, but no,
not just the roof deck.
Yeah, but and I think, and I also think that like you talk about composers like if you look at someone like Bach, who wrote this some of the most transcendent music of all time, man of deep religious faith, but his music is mathematically brilliant, it's spiritually brilliant. But his day-to-day, he was a working church musician who was complaining that these people wouldn't pay him for the funerals that he performed at. Where's my bill? Or I took this job. I thought I was promised this much, and then I got paid a third of that. And I have all these kids to support. There's not a whole lot of deep writing on terms of that survives of his own thoughts. It's mostly like complaining about the business of being a working musician and having to write. I mean, he had to write these like kowtowy cantatas to these minor noblemen to get paid a few $100 or something. It was just like, some things don't change. And I think that like, how do you balance the art and the commerce? Yes, you can write transcendent stuff, but sometimes you just have to write the stuff that pays the bills. And I think that when you're in that sort of field, when you reach that higher, like, I don't need to worry about that, or let someone else handle that. But
the visionaries and dreamers are dreams turn into nightmares very quickly. And I think the tech world is a fascinating place for this because, the tech world has incentivized and made a lot of money off of incentivizing people who are thinking way outside of the box, these sort of like visionaries that are imagining all these different worlds and things like that. And it is, and often not incentivizing people who can like run a profitable business that pays its bills on time and takes in more money than it puts out. And I think that's like, so that's a world where you see this sort of, these sort of constraints. And sometimes it is these genius visionaries who like make this leap. They might not be fiscally responsible. The books might be half cooked, but they like manage to get it across the line, and this massive technology change has happened and it works. And it's like super, and it's a good thing. But just as often, actually much more often. I mean, I think a private equity firm only needs to be right like 1 in 20 times, or excuse me, a venture capital firm only needs to be right like 1 in 10, run in 20 times to make money, because the returns are so enormous when you do. Is that like more often things fall apart and the business goes under. The visionary is a visionary but not actually, able to run this business, or the world isn't ready for this idea, or something like that happens. And that struggle is fascinating. And I think this is where, one of my big concerns is when you have too much power concentrated anywhere, dumb ideas last a lot longer. And I think that's the big thing and a thing that is like in a lot of my writing and things like that, is that like dumb ideas are going to happen. And in some ways they're a good sign. They're a sign that people are thinking big. They're trying new things. A lot of people, some of the best ideas are from people who failed a bunch of times and learned lessons from it. What the concern though is that you get into these like sort of existential problems before the learning curve catches up. And when you have totalitarianism, where you have, where like a lot of the great, sort of cities that were these sort of like single planner cities, right?
Like
St. Petersburg, Brasilia, exactly. They're built by dictators.
Versailles,
and they're
the palace and city of Versailles, built by a dictator.
Right.
People go to Paris.
Exactly.
They don't go to Versailles to see the city of Versailles. They go there just to see the palace. But it is kind of if you look at it from overhead, it is kind of a sterile. Inside it's not sterile, but the outside is kind of this geometric thing all arranged around the king's bedroom.
Yeah, exactly. And, spent so much money on it that, shortly thereafter, the kings are no longer in France. Like our St. Petersburg is a great example, right? It's built to be a seaport, right? The problem is it's built on a swamp. That's the access to the seaport. And people are dying in droves as they're building it. And Peter has the ability, because, Russia has a very sort of serf, which is not essentially a slave, they don't have control of their own lives. He's just forcing people to send serfs to work, and like most of them die every like 6 months or a year as they're digging the ditches and things like that to build this city.
So if you were a Russian boyar, your beard would have been cut off too, because that would not have been. If you had moved to St. Petersburg, he was lopping off people's beards, saying that's too old world. Anyway,
that's right, very old world. But he'd done the tour of England and he'd done the tour of Europe. These beards are sort of backwards. You need to keep up with the times. But yeah, like these things are done. And I think that like, America has had no shortage of bad ideas, but what America has tended to be in sort of like the world historical sense is pretty quick to step back from bad ideas. And I think that like, that's one of the great strengths. And in this period in America, there were a lot of bad ideas in this post-war period because business and government were so intertwined in many cases, no one came in and said like, this is stupid.
Too many people are making too much money and everyone's getting their ego stroked.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And like, there's I think after World War II, there's a really interesting, I've been thinking about this a lot. I was watching the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary recently, and it is shocking how much everybody knows that it's a pretty unwinnable war. From very, very early, Kennedy knows this, Johnson knows this. All these people know that this is not a particularly winnable war. The Vietnamese have been fighting any invader for 1,000 years. Like but they can't say it. And they just lie over and over and over. There is this, the greatest generation in its post-World War II aspect. There's something about a complete willingness to completely lie to the American people and say the exact opposite of everything you know to be true. That is complex. Maybe it's every generation's like that. I don't know. But like, that's the thing you really see. And there is this sense that these are terrible ideas and everyone knows it. And people somehow feel powerless to stop them. Powerless to be honest and try to do something about these terrible ideas, because everyone seems to agree. Well, Democrats, Republicans, everyone agrees.
People will say, well, this time is different. This time is different. We've surpassed this. We've advanced so far that we don't need to worry about, these things that came before us, these people came before us. I think it's just an overall, lack of humility, which we're seeing on so many fronts right now.
Some markets and technological financial solutions, Stephen, are so efficient they can only go up.
Only go up. Yeah,
unsinkable stocks. That's a thing, right? They'll get from England to America in no time flat, and they'll be unsinkable no matter what's in the way. Yeah, it's just, that's a real, and you kind of want that a little bit. You want that if you think about this, and I think about a lot about people we're sort of evolved to live around 50 people or something like that. Mm-hmm. It would be like Cotes would call it Tioche Paye. It's like the traveling band, where our brains are built for that. You want an insanely optimistic hype man, hype woman, right out there, who's really gung ho about no, I swear, dude, we can totally kill buffalo. I've got a way to do it. You want this lunatic, and a lot of them end up killing themselves, over this, getting gored by a buffalo or whatever it is. They're no, you can absolutely. That grass, that kind of grass, you can grind it up and whip it with water and throw it on a hot rock, and you've got this. It's delicious. You want these crazy hype people pushing society forward. You just want to not bet the entire farm on them. And that's where that balance getting out of whack is really the thing. And I think that's, and balance is the oldest of values, but the least popular. You know what I mean?
What do you mean to have constraints? I think, or what do you mean there's, but I think
that's for other people.
Yeah.
All the other plutocrats in history, they needed to be constrained. But me, I'm smarter.
Yeah.
And so therefore, yeah.
Well,
classic story.
One thing I would like to talk about is at the same time as you're preparing for the new version of your book, there's another book about the South Bronx, Born in Flames by Benj Ansfield. Yeah. And I'd sort of like to know what your thoughts on this historian's take is.
Got it right here.
Yeah, they say that this was more a case of organized arson than what you say in terms of bad computer programming and the best of intentions. Can you speak to that thesis?
Yeah, it's not a new thesis. This was the prevailing wisdom at the time, was that it was arson that was burning down the Bronx. And there were two sides of this arson argument. From the left, the argument was that it was landlords, that were doing this for insurance money. And, that was often more than a hint of anti-Semitism in that involved. In the Bronx, the landlords tended to be Jewish. Jewish lightning was the term that was used amongst people to say that it was landlords doing all of this. The other argument on arson was that it was tenants. You could you would move up the list to get into public housing if you were burned out of your apartment. There was money made available by the Red Cross and places like that for people who, were burned out of their apartments. Both of these things happened. Both real. This happened. There were people that lit their own apartments on fire to get social welfare services. Not many, but there were some. There were landlords who did this. Maybe, probably more. It's all documented. And I write about it pretty extensively in my book.
You can't fix it up, you fix it down, as was said.
Right, exactly. It's very real. The problem is it's late. The fires have already been happening for a decade by the point that this starts to happen. You look at the numbers, and I ran the numbers. I interviewed the fire marshals. I talked to the firefighters. I talked to the people of these communities. I talked to the people that worked in real estate and all these sorts of things. Before you get arson, you get the massive unemployment that undergirds all of this stuff that comes from intentionally, getting rid of factories and industry. That comes first, is that people don't have money to pay rent. They don't have money to fix up the apartments. And redline, you can get the loans to fix the roof and things like that, because the neighborhood has been deemed low class, low quality because, there's black people that live there. There's Puerto Rican people that live there. Then you get normal fires that are not fought appropriately because the city is slashing fire services.
They're kind of reaching that stage around 50 or 60 years old when things begin to go wrong.
Yeah, exactly right. These things start to happen, and you need upkeep. So yes, by the mid-late 1970s, 1974, 75, 76, arson shoots way up. But until 1974, the official numbers are less than 2% of fires in New York City are deemed arson. Those estimates are low. The fire marshals had been slashed. The city did not investigate much of any arson at all. And a lot of firefighters wouldn't bother putting suspicious if they based on a fire, they wouldn't bother. So those numbers are low, but they're not that low. And by the late 70s, the fire department is really the Red Caps program, this really the huge increase in fire marshal hiring. And the city is incentivized, the fire department is incentivized to say, yes, suspicious, because it means more money for the Red Cap program, more investigations. Maybe they'll stop setting these fires and I don't want to, respond to these. And it gets up to like 7.7%. And that certainly is higher in many neighborhoods. But what comes first is people stop investing in the buildings. They stop paying their real estate taxes. You have, and the conventional fires are because you have things like, if the landlord doesn't get oil in the burner, which is very common because this is also the oil crisis time, the OPEC boycotts, people are using space heaters. Space heaters in the 1970s.
Ovens sometimes. They do the ovens.
Very often ovens. Yeah, exactly. Well, if it's connected to gas, yeah. Which it might not be. The building hasn't paid its gas bill and they shut it off. You have people like literally using like rigging up their own sort of pseudo wood stoves and things like that, and like opening a window and setting fires and charcoal fires and things like that. You have way too many people. Overcrowding is actually one of the first. You can find there's interesting studies on this. When you got above 1.5 people per room in an apartment, fire rates skyrocket because you just have that much more flammable material around. You have people crammed in. You have way too few, too old electrical outlets with too many plugs into them. You have all these things and the rates go way up. And then the city stops. The city starts cutting these fire departments. And so what you have is a massive increase in response. Response time is sort of the key stat here. A fire that you get to in, say 5 minutes, maybe it burns out a room. You get there in 6 or 7 minutes. It might burn out the entire apartment or the entire floor. It might spread to the entire building. Bushwick was the worst neighborhood for this because they have what's known as a common cockloft. They would build these entire blocks across by one developer. And that top attic was actually connected.
You didn't have a firewall or party wall. It would just shoot
no firewall.
Wow.
Exactly. They might have put up some plywood or something like that. But so you're talking about a minute can be the difference between a room or a second, third floor of a building catching fire or an entire block burning out. And you have this sweep of fires. Tom Von Essen, who was eventually the fire commissioner under Rudy Giuliani. He was a president of the union, and was a firefighter in the South Bronx during this period. I was asking about the arson. And before he said, oh yeah, arson, big thing. But honestly, that was almost better. That was happening in abandoned buildings, 74, 75, 76, the later 70s. We'd show up, and you put some water on it. You did what you could. If it collapsed, it collapsed. They're abandoned buildings. Maybe they're being traded back and forth by insurance companies and stuff like that. But no one was dying. We weren't dying because we weren't rushing in. Before that, they were normal fires and people were dying and we were rushing in and getting ourselves killed. And 10 firemen a year dying in New York City for years. Never mind that's like dying on the job. Never mind the heart attacks 10 years later and, the lung disease and stuff like that. There is just this is far. So the book is cool in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff. These landlord arson rackets are very real. I mean, it's like a wild time and it is another case study in good intentions. Really well, they're trying insurance redlining is the main thing. You couldn't get fire insurance in these neighborhoods. And they have a good intentioned policy to give it out. And then scurrilous elements take advantage of it and they do a bad job of the planning of it. And the landlord arson is real. But, 10 years before this stuff happens, 1964, one of the officers in Engine Company 82 in the South Bronx walks in December. I think they're having like the Christmas dinner in the firehouse and that. And he walks in and says, guys, we just did our 4,000th run of the year. And everybody's shocked. 4,000. It's like more than 10 a day. Everyone's stunned at how big a number this is in 1964. By 1968, that number has more than doubled. It's over 9,000 by then. Fires of which, this has never happened. There are great conflagrations, the great London fire, Chicago, San Francisco. This is not one big fire. This is day after day after day after day. This is, neighborhoods where all the kids, where the schools smell like smoke because so many kids got burnt out the night before. This is just like, and it is not one great thing. It's bit by bit. And it is a complicated story. It's not a politically convenient story. It isn't, you can't just demonize landlords as the bad guys. You can't just demonize poor people, usually not white, as the bad guys in this thing. It's a complicated story about what happens. And so it's like not politically convenient for one side or another. And these numbers, so I told you, like it goes from like 4,000 to like 9,000 in 1968. And that's exactly when the city starts closing fire companies.
Well, I think that's the thing that you really, I think why this new version of your book is so timely is that like, we're just moving away from complexity. People want straightforward narratives, and people glom onto those narratives. And I think that's something that unfortunately you've talked about before, about even very, very smart people, quote unquote. They still want these narratives. Like, this is how it is, and I don't want to deal with complexity because that is just inconvenient to, these sets I hold dear. I think it's a problem where it's exacerbated by social media. And
absolutely.
And I think that like this,
but it's true everywhere too. Like I think a lot of places, academia, I think ended up censoring itself really significantly in part because of tenure. Ironically enough, right? Tenure is set up as like sort of anti-McCarthy Red Scares, right?
Well, it's not about careerism. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. It's not. Well, I think there's no greater censor than careerism. Mm-hmm. I think that's the thing. I was middle of writing my book and I came across an academic who had come across some of the same studies I had of the Wallaces that did this studies of the Rand thing. And he said, I was in the middle of my book at the time and he said, I just thought about writing that book. And I forget what the terms were, but it was a complicated post this, pre that, structuralist, Marxist something, some academic school theory thought and how it was this and that and the other. And I said, I came in thinking too that it was like they were burning down the Bronx on purpose as like a real estate grab or something like that. But then I went and interviewed everybody. And the guys who made the cuts, these are not like racists. They really thought they were good liberals by doing this. They thought they were right. They thought the science was correct and that what they did was useful. These are people that like, it's about screwing up a lot more than screwing over people. There's a lot of bad elements, don't get me wrong, but and he says like, oh, well, I was like, so yeah, it's just not true, like that angle. And he's like, well, that's not what matters. Oh. It fits the bill of that structuralist argument. Yeah. I was like, well, yeah, but it fitting the bill of an argument that like works in a school of thought that you have is not true.
Well, I mean, Mark,
and he was like, no, but that's not how academia works. Like I work in a theory. I will get tenure because the person backs me for tenure and they're of this school. Your job is to promote your school of thought, and the details are not as important. And he was being unusually, he was tipsy at the time and maybe exaggerating a little bit, being unusually sort of candid about this. But I think that was, he wasn't that interested in the realities on the ground. What was interesting was a compelling framing and argument to make, which was sort of artistic, but was also because like the people who backed him as a PhD candidate were of this school. And the worst thing you could ever do in academia is bite the hand that feeds you.
Oh, of course. And I think, Marxism, you have to understand, you have to know Marx to understand what has shaped so much of modern history. But I think the temptation is it becomes like a religion. It not becomes just a thing to study, it becomes the thing to study. And I think that's the sort of trap of a lot of people who are in often elite settings is, well, there's the one way to do things. And
right.
There's the one way to do things. It's been, well, how could you, you could be cast out. I think there's a lot of analogies between, it's like, look at like what caused, many ways the Reformation. How could you question? And I think you have these forces. It's sort of like, well, if you question that, or what if you come up with another school of thought, or God forbid, what if you translate the Bible into German or English, from Latin? There's not one direct source, and the people in the
Luther went straight to the Greek, man. Didn't even go with Latin.
Exactly,
went right
exactly.
And the Reformation is a fascinating period in this of, and I think similar to right now. I think the Reformation, I think Gutenberg invents the sort of movable typeface, metal stamp. Like he does that, like it's like what, maybe 50 years before the Reformation.
Yep.
This is,
Martin Luther's in the early 1500s, and then Henry VIII is mid 1500s. So it all sort of.
Yeah. I think it's like 1517 is the 95 Theses.
Yes.
1516
so,
or something
yeah.
like that. I'm trying to remember
Martin Luther came from the inside, which made him, he was a Catholic I don't remember if he's a priest or a monk. I think he might have been a monk.
He's a monk.
But I think that's the thing. Often when these revolutions come from the inside versus some guy on the outside. Well, in Europe at the time, in Western Europe, there's only one thing. There's the Catholic Church. But we are going through something like that right now, where orthodoxies are being challenged and it's just extremely uncomfortable. And I think the people who will thrive, ironically enough, are the people who do understand the complexity, can hear these multiple arguments versus the dogma. I just need
dogma, but the other people that survive when there's a communications technology change, whether that's the printing press, that precedes the Reformation, the sort of internet, social media we've got right now. World War II, people always forget that's a war fought by kind of failures who were really good at radio. Churchill was kind of a failure before World War II. Certainly as a military leader. And, he was sort of on the outs.
Gallipoli? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. FDR was sort of seen as like the least consequential of the people that worked for Al Smith. Certainly, Mussolini, same thing. These are radio charismats who are, a case of Hitler, sort of a failed artist, watch out for the failed artists. Plato was onto something maybe. But you have these people who are masters of a dominant new communications technology where there are no gatekeepers. And this is the thing about Luther. Luther, even before the Reformation, he is printing up. So if you were a student, he was a teacher at, I think it's Wittenberg University, right? You were studying the Bible. The Bible was filled with commentaries. The Bible you would read as a student, it's in Latin, but it's also but you would be filled with comments from, a long line of scholars and monks and these people, making comments about this and comments about that. And it sort of represents the beyond the text itself thoughts of the, 1500 years of the Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church, right? Luther goes to the university printer and he says, give me a version with none of the commentaries. It's the beginning of sola scriptura, with the word itself. This is a big, big thing, that you're dealing with the word itself. And, and then he says, of course, he translates. He's not just nailing the theses to the wall of the church, which may or may not have happened. That's maybe apocryphal story, but, he certainly printed it and sent it out. And that's the big difference. You had John Wycliffe in England, you had Savonarola, you had these people who were challenging church orthodoxy. The church would mostly burn them and move on. Jan Hus, was probably the most recent before Luther. But Luther prints this stuff and sends it everywhere. And it is obviously very compelling material and thoughts theologically. Luther's a pretty brilliant thinker, but it's also really convenient to a lot of people. There are people who, certainly with John Wycliffe and, sort of John of Gaunt was big with the sort of.
It was very convenient to Henry VIII because he was looking for a reason to divorce Catherine of Aragon. It was very convenient for a lot of these German princes who were like, why should I pay all this money to the Pope? Why?
And there had been
I
a
want to rule
long
my own little
line.
principality with a hyphen in the middle of it. So
that's exactly right. And there had been a long line. Henry VIII was not the first to do this. Many English kings had been interested in this before. And the argument had been made pretty explicitly that, hey, that means we get the church lands. It was always seen as a very fiscal deal.
Sacking of the abbeys. It's all about the money. It's sacking of the monasteries in England.
Now, very few people want to admit that it's about the, John of Gaunt probably would have, right? That's a cynical power player if ever there was one. But most people don't want to admit it's about the money because we're never the bad guy we're never the greedy guy in our own story. Or, there's the line, who is it, Upton Sinclair about, a man gets very good at not understanding what his paycheck requires him to not understand,
Well, that's the thing. It's everyone, that's sort of the sort of contradiction of universities. There's all this talk about ideological purity, but what pays the professors' salaries? Stocks and bonds and Google and Apple and God knows what else. We're all
donations from shady international actors in many cases
here. And I think that's the thing. How do you make your peace in a flawed world versus you can't just let the flaws rule the world, but at the same time, it's are we all unblemished here by this? And I think that, that's sort of the thing we're dealing with right now. I think, unfortunately, between AI and political instability and social media, we are kind of entering another reformation, and it's going to be, and an industrial revolution. So there are a bunch of things just sort of converging on us, which when before the narrative seems so simple and secure, so people are holding on to, and I think that's creating a lot of the polarization is on the far left, people are holding on to Marxism, this is how the world works, and this is something that will always hold true. On the far right, it's evangelical Christianity and, traditional, we need to go back to the 50s and hold on to that. And it's going to be, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that just from what we were talking about, we are going through like this sort of period of great change and dislocation.
All the narratives are up for grabs.
Yep.
And I think that I don't think we would have a reformation in the sense that in a pure like theological sense, because I think, I think we're seeing a little bit of it. There's this, David Foster Wallace has this, his commencement speech at Kenyon College about how like, pick what you're going to worship because you're going to worship something. It's just too deeply embedded in the human brain to not do it. You're going to end up, whether it's youth or money or yourself or your, whatever it is, you're going to worship something. And I think that this idea that like, there was this funny, remember the whole like Dawkins, like, well, let's get rid of religion. It's the source of all the bad stuff. You know what I mean? Like this, like sort of completely ahistorical sense of how like the world works. That like if we get rid of religion, everything will be fine. And it's like, no, you could be a non-religious murderer just as easily as a religiously inspired one, because you're going to worship something.
Yeah.
And maybe you're going to worship, like it. And that I think is the thing that sort of complication is a thing that we forget. And if you don't have good things to worship that are supportive, and are sort of tempering and are, give you a sense of humility and service and owing it to other people, we're going to see that. And I think that's this sort of moment we're in where people are, the Don Draper line about like, that somebody says like, you perpetrate the great lie or something like that, to Don Draper in Mad Men. And he says, people are so desperate to be told what to do that the most of them will listen to anybody.
Yeah.
And I think in a moment when technology is completely changing things, economics is completely changing things, when all these massive societal shifts are happening, a lot of people are really desperate to be told that they are okay. And that, like to be given something that's comforting. And they'll often choose that. They'll listen to that, even if it comes along with a lot of other stuff that they should know better than to listen to. And I think that a message that's comforting to people, which is often a message that is scapegoating and blaming somebody else for it, is particularly potent whenever you have this communications technology change, when suddenly anybody can just, send wirelesses across the pond, and people can put up radio signals and say whatever.
Now
and
we all know what's going
anything
on in people's brains, and we think, what is going on? You walk down the street, you're like, what is going on in their brains? And now you're like, oh boy, oh boy, this is what's actually going on. I think that.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder about like the equal time doctrine, right, which went away in the 80s, but it used to be after World War II, the government owns all of the communications network. They own all the bandwidth, right? The TV signals, the radio signals. The government has to lease those out to radio and television stations. And being very aware of what happened to Europe leading up to World War II with a lot of lunatics saying a lot of lunatic stuff. And it wasn't just, Germany, we focus on the Nazis, rightly so. The communists, it seems like the communists maybe did burn down the Reichstag. Like there was a lot of crazy coming from every direction. And the US government says, you've got to come through us to get to get those signals, and you need equal time. You need to have a balance between the perspectives. And that went away in the 80s. And it was, a lot of people were really excited about it. Say like, it's no longer the corporate world that holds us back and homogenizes everything and centralizes everything.
Shall bloom, and instead we get what we have now.
There were some Michelangelos, but what you get are also a lot of Pied Pipers.
That is true. Joe, before we close, I just want to just a few lines about like another thing that you've been working on away from the big cities is you spent also a lot of time at the Pine Ridge Reservation. And can you talk a little bit about your work with the native population, how that sort of feeds into your creative work?
Living in a rural area is a very different thing from living. I grew up in the suburbs. I spent a lot of time living in New York City. Yeah, after college, I went and taught in Pine Ridge, extremely rural. It is about as foreign as you can get, where people all still, mostly speak English and smoke Marlboros and do all that sort of stuff. It is, especially for a city kid, suburban kid. I think understanding rural life is really important. I think that, it was a thing I learned, I moved out there in 2004. And it was funny how much I started finding myself getting like sort of microaggression would be the sort of collegiate leftist term, but like how much American media kind of shit on the middle of the country. You know, this idea of flyover country, you know, like you sort of there's just casual jokes about like, you know, laughing off rural areas and things like that. I was like, oh, funny. I didn't realize we were constantly making fun of the middle, you know, the middle of America. That's probably really frustrating to a lot of people who live in these places. And I think that is a real, you know, you also gain so much respect for a lot of labor. You know, one of the things I've had to do is like, you know, like the ranching industry is hard, man. And it's not like, and it's physically difficult, but mentally difficult and complicated. A lot of really smart people.
Alone too. I mean, my grandfather on my dad's side spent a lot of time either on a tractor or on a horse, planting and pulling up sugar beets. It was lonely, hard work.
A buddy of mine talks about, he called it tractor love. It's you meet somebody at, you know, like a VFW dance on Friday night, and then, you know, you meet somebody. Oh, yeah, and then the next morning, you know, you get into the tractor, you know, at 5 a.m. and you're thinking like, oh, it was pretty interesting. Bet that probably was talk later. And by noon, you've fallen in love. By 3 p.m., you've jilted each other. By, you know, 6 p.m., you hate that person you met. And then, but when you get out of the tractor, you realize nothing has happened. This is just your mind grinding away, like doing, cause you're bored. Tractor love. And I think about that as a metaphor for a lot of things, you know, that like when you're outside of a certain reality, you know, like there's no new data coming in, you're just spinning. It's like a metaphor for the internet sometimes. Yeah, exactly. You know, that's,
well, I mean,
but yeah, it's a incredibly, but I've always been, you know, sort of blessed to be out there and learned so much from a lot of people and gotten to do all kinds of cool things. And yeah, like an archery coach. I was an archery coach at Oglala Lakota College, have met amazing people and learned all these different, you know, facets of life and learned how to, I'm okay on a horse. I'm not great. I learned archery better than horseback work. They still, if I do a roundup somewhere, like you know, for sorting season, like they people put me on 4-wheelers. My horse might freak the cows out or something like that. They don't respect my true cowboy skills very much. But
you've done tremendous work out there, and like what your other work that you've done on the Pine Ridge Reservation is like a whole other wonderful story in itself. But I'm just amazed at. You know, I've known you for quite a long time, and I'm just amazed at how the breadth of your work, how you've been able to span cities, the Great Plains, and the artist life, the entrepreneurial life. And thank you for being such a good friend and an inspiration, and for your thoughts on this podcast. So thank you so much, Joe Flood.
Thank you, Stephen. I've always gotten back a lot more than I gave. But you know, and plus all the indulgences I don't have to buy now. So that's very important. Thanks so much for having me, man. This is a real pleasure.
Well, I mean, to lean into Walt Whitman is part of the solution to sing a song of yourself versus today's problems versus sing a song of the amorphous AI generated crowds.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. As I say though, I think this is LaGuardia. The only solution to the problems of democracy, more democracy.
Yep. Okay. All right. Joe Flood, thank you so much. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.